Hello, welcome to 17th Century Tales from Cavalier Newark. My name is Adam Nightingale and I'll be bringing you forgotten stories from the East Midlands Civil War past, recorded from a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. Episode 3, Spy Story. In any war, often a side is only as good as the intelligence provided for it by spies and secret agents. The British Civil Wars were no different. Both the Roundheads and the Cavaliers had sophisticated spy networks with exotic techniques for smuggling information or money or whatever needed to be transported covertly across the country. Cavalier Newark has his own particularly distinctive spy story. It took place during the closing days of the Third Siege of Newark. It involved royalty, secret messages, a manhunt, and must stand as one of the most bizarre and quite frankly disgusting stories of espionage in all of recorded English history. A bold claim, perhaps. Well, listen on. But before we get down into the nitty-gritty, grubby, and quite frankly unsavory details of this particular spy story, let me first explain some of the techniques that were commonly employed in espionage during the Civil Wars. You're probably already aware of this one, but secret messages could be written using lemon juice. Lemon juice, once it has dried, is virtually invisible, until you hold a candle under the secret message written in lemon juice ink, and then the light of the candle perfectly illuminates the secret message. Lemon juice is good, but if you're really serious about your spying in the 17th century, then you will use artichoke juice. It's much better. An ingenious method of transporting a secret message is use an egg. Hide your message in an egg without removing the yolk. That's the trick. How is that possible? It is possible. Let me tell you how you do it. Firstly, you've got to soak the egg in vinegar. This softens the shell enough so that you can make a tiny cut in the shell of the egg with a very small and very sharp knife. Then you take your message and slide the message into the raw egg. You place the egg in a bowl of cold water, and the cold water will harden the egg shell. Ingenious. But it wasn't just secret messages that needed to be transported across the country. It was money. And obviously that was a little bit more difficult to conceal. One of the best ways to conceal money and transport it across the country was to hide it in bars of soap. This was a technique favoured by one of Charles I's most efficient and effective spies. Her name was Jane Horwood. Yes, one of Charles I's most efficient and effective spies was a woman. In fact, women made very good spies in the Civil War. And the reason for this isn't very complimentary to the male of the species in the 17th century. You see, the reason that women made very good spies is that men thought women were, how can I put this delicately, a little bit thick. Consequently, men would sometimes talk about things that were politically or militarily sensitive in the presence of women, confident in the notion that the women in question couldn't possibly understand a word of what they were talking about. And some of these women were enemy spies, understanding perfectly well what was being spoken about, taking notes, and passing the information on to their own spy masters. Back to Jane Horwood. Jane Horwood transported gold in laundry baskets, hidden, as I said earlier, in bars of soap. The combination of the fact that she was a woman, she had a license to travel up and down the country with laundry, and the fact that the money embedded in the soap was probably like mixed in with lots of people's dirty underwear, combined to make her very, very successful at what she did. So successful, in fact, that she smuggled 1,705 pounds of gold from London to Oxford towards the end of the Civil War. Gold was used to fund the escape from England of King Charles I's French Catholic wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, and their eldest son, Charles, the Prince of Wales, who would go on to become Charles II. A few more interesting facts about women's spies before we move on. Women's spies were called she-intelligencers, and one of the best things about being a she-intelligencer, and this was the flip side of the casual sexism embedded in the culture of the time, was that if you were captured for being a spy and you were a woman, you weren't executed, like men were. Another quality that would mark you out as excellent spy material in the 17th century was being very good at maths. Secret messages were often sent in complicated ciphers and codes. In a cipher, numbers or sequences of numbers are often substituted for letters. And while the Cavaliers proved a lot more progressive in seeing the potential for women as spies, it was the Roundheads who were better at employing mathematicians to break codes. After the Civil War, actually after the execution of Charles I, when Cromwell was ruling the country as Lord Protector, his spymaster John Thurlow was expert at recruiting the best mathematicians in order to crack codes and expose secret royalist societies like the Sealed Knot. That's enough context about the state of espionage in the 17th century. Let's get down to the story in question. The extraordinary mission conducted by an anonymous spy during the Third Siege of Newark in May 1646. But the story begins with another siege in another part of the country. Oxford was the royalist capital of the kingdom during the Civil War. Oxford was about to be besieged by the great Roundhead general and commander-in-chief of Parliament's new model army, Sir Thomas Fairfax. King Charles I was in Oxford at the time. The king had effectively lost the war, his army having been wiped out, more or less, at the Battle of Naseby almost a year ago in June 1645. But the king had carried on fighting with increasingly diminishing returns as towns and cities fell one after the other to his Roundhead enemies. The king sought counsel from his advisors as to what to do about this enemy army on his doorstep. Surrender was an option, but many of his advisors felt that if the king did surrender, the Roundheads would kill him. So if death was inevitable, then why not go out in a blaze of glory, a final battle, die with honour fighting the Roundheads? The king wasn't keen on this advice. Not that he was a coward. Charles had a plan. He had figured out a way to carry on fighting the war and, at this 11th hour, perhaps even win it. His plan was to turn the entire Presbyterian Scottish army against their English allies. It was an outrageous plan, really, considering Charles I's relationship with Scotland, which had been traditionally somewhat tense. The tensions between the king and most of Scotland had arisen because of religion. The king was an Anglican, and most of Scotland was a branch of Puritanism called Presbyterianism. Before the Civil War, the king had caused the Scots quite a bit of trouble and vexation when he tried to force them to worship God the Anglican way. His insistence on the Presbyterian Church, or Kirk, using the English Book of Common Prayer resulted in riots, the stoning of the Dean of Edinburgh during a church service, and England invading Scotland. The two wars that followed as a consequence of this, that we call the Bishops' Wars, resulted in two costly defeats for England. Unsurprisingly, when the Civil War broke out, Presbyterian Scotland, that is most of Scotland, fought against King Charles I. But that was 4 years ago. Things had changed since the beginning of the war. Tensions existed between Charles's English and Scottish enemies that were there to be exploited. At the beginning of the war, Parliament had promised the Presbyterians certain religious freedoms in England if they fought against the king. But now that the war was nearly over, it didn't look like Parliament were going to honour their part of the bargain. The king's plan was to leave Oxford in disguise, find the Scottish army, and persuade the Scots to change sides. The king intended to do this by reminding the Scots that despite their past differences, he actually had more in common with them than they did with the English. After all, was not his grandmother Mary Queen of Scots, and was not his father James the Sixth King of Scotland before he ever became James the First, the King of England and Scotland? The king was confident that this would do the trick, and once the Scots had seen sense, they would fall in line and join him and kick the Roundheads out of London, and he would sit on the throne of England once again. So where does Newark fit into all of this? Be patient, I'll get there. The king only told a small group of trusted subjects his true intentions. His plan was to slip out of Oxford in the early hours of the morning in disguise. His disguise of choice was to dress as a priest. He had his hair cut and his beard restyled. He exchanged his royal garments for a priest's cassock. He selected 2 men to accompany him. The first man was called John Ashburnham. His official job title was Groom of the Bedchamber. In other words, one of the king's most trusted and personal attendants. The second man was Michael Hudson, the king's personal chaplain, who had such a reputation for speaking his mind that his nickname was the Plain-Speaking Chaplain. Michael Hudson was also a spy, responsible for conducting espionage for the king in the north of England. In April 1646, Michael Hudson, John Ashburnham, and Charles I, the King of England, who was disguised as a priest, crossed over Magdalen Bridge and passed through Oxford East Gate at 3 o'clock in the morning. The king had ordered the governor of Oxford to lock the gate behind them and not to open any of Oxford's gates once they had departed for 5 days, so that the king and his tiny entourage could get a head start before it became common knowledge that the king was at large and effectively on the run. The division of labour between Hudson and Ashburnham went like this. Ashburnham's job was principally to tend to the king's needs, while Hudson did all the planning. Hudson had to figure out the best way to get the king to the Scots. It was a plan fraught with risk. What complicated matters more was the fact that the king was prone to change his mind and change his plans at the last minute. The king wanted to go to London and surprise his subjects. Presumably Michael Hudson, the plain-speaking chaplain, talked him out of it. What made matters easier for Michael Hudson, John Ashburnham, and King Charles I was that the Scottish army more or less came to him. And this, at last, is where Newark comes into the story. Newark was a town particularly distinguished by its fierce loyalty to the king, and was one of the last towns in the kingdom, along with Oxford, still fighting for the king, currently under siege by the Roundhead army. It was surrounded by 17,000 enemy soldiers, a large proportion of which were Scottish Presbyterian soldiers. Now all he had to do was to get to Newark without being recognised or captured. It was a risky journey, peppered with a few near misses. At one point, the 3 travellers were walking on one side of the road, keeping their heads down, while on the other side of the road a bunch of mounted Roundhead soldiers trotted by, oblivious to the fact that they were mere feet away from the King of England. There was a very close call when the 3 travellers were stopped at a Roundhead checkpoint and asked, "To whom do you belong?" Either Hudson or Ashburnham replied, "To the House of Commons," and the Roundheads believed them and let them pass, didn't have a good look at them, didn't test them with further questions, just let them pass. As the king and his small entourage approached Newark, Michael Hudson recruited a spy. We don't know who the spy was. His identity remains a mystery to this day. We do know what the spy was asked to do. The king needed to get a secret message to the governor of Newark, Lord John Bellasyse. The secret message would tell Lord John that the king, at some point early in the month of May, would surrender to the Scots, and that Lord John Bellasyse must not be put off or discouraged by the news, because the Scots would treat the king with, and this is to quote the king, "all the liberty, honour, and safety that could be desired." With this in mind, Lord John was to hold the town until the Scots swapped sides and drove the English away. Now, in order to accomplish this, the spy was to sneak into Newark, bypassing the Roundhead besieging army, and deliver a secret message to Lord John Bellasyse, concealed in such a way that if captured, the Roundheads would never find this message. The spy was forced to take desperate measures to ensure this was the case. The spy could not afford to rely on the normal, tried and tested methods of concealment, like a hidden compartment in his shoe or sewing the message into the line of his clothing. He couldn't hide this message in a bar of soap or even a raw egg. The spy had to swallow the message. You can't just swallow a piece of paper, can you? The paper will be dissolved or destroyed by the digestive juices in your stomach. The message from the king was placed in a hollow lead bullet called a slug bullet, and the spy swallowed the bullet. They didn't know about lead poisoning back then. We're not completely certain how he did it, but the spy managed to sneak past the besieging Roundhead army and navigate Newark's robust siege defences without being seen. Once he was within the walls of Newark, it would have become evident to the spy, had he not known this already, that Newark was suffering horribly from an outbreak of the plague. Presumably, apart from essential personnel that were needed to man the defences of Newark, the streets would have been largely empty as the spy threaded his way through the town to get to the governor's house. The governor's house is still there, by the way. If you've already listened to the podcast on the 3 sieges of Newark, you'll know what the governor's house is today. If you don't, I'm going to tell you. I never get tired of saying this. It's a Greg's. A Greg's! Can you believe it? A Greg's. The spy entered the governor's house, or Greg's, and delivered his message from the king. In order to do this, he had to request and quaff some physic. Physic being, in this instance, a nice early modern European word for a bowel-loosening laxative. Having taken the physic, the spy literally defecated a message from the king. I cannot think of another instance in the history of espionage where a message from the king was delivered in such a fashion. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I've never heard of it. King Charles I didn't just turn up unannounced amongst the Scots. He paved the way for himself. Before the king had even left Oxford, a Frenchman turned up in the nearby town of Southwell. He was called Montreux, and he was there initially to test the water to see if the Scots were receptive to the king's new plan. They appeared to be. But when in May the king actually turned up in Southwell and surrendered to the Scots at the King's Inn Arms, well, they captured him. And then they took him to Newcastle. And then they kept him there a prisoner for 9 months. And then they sold him back to the English for a whopping £100,000. Newark was ordered to surrender a few days after the king's capture. And that poor anonymous spy, his humiliating act of service done in the name of his king, was in vain. We all know what happened to the king. After failing to negotiate with his own parliament and starting a second civil war from his prison cell, the king would eventually be put on trial for treason and beheaded. John Ashburnham would later be locked up in the Tower of London and banished 3 times to the Channel Islands by the Roundheads for his secret service to the king. But that was chicken feed compared to the gory fate that awaited Michael Hudson. After the war, he helped organise a royalist rebellion against Parliament. He died fighting for his life in Woodcroft Castle in Northamptonshire. He was trapped on the castle roof when the Roundheads finally surrounded him. Now brace yourselves, this is pretty nasty. They tried to throw him off the roof, so he clung onto the battlements. They chopped his hands off. He fell a considerable distance into the castle moat. He survived the fall, and he tried to make it to the shore, minus his hands, only to be beaten to death across the head with the wrong end of a Roundhead musket. Oh, and while we're here, I might as well tell you what happened to Jane Horwood, since you're asking. After the Civil War, Jane Horwood was imprisoned but not executed by the Roundheads. She was still alive when Oliver Cromwell died and King Charles II was restored to the throne, but all her good work and sacrifice had been forgotten, and nobody rewarded her for her excellent service to the king. Shameful. The irony of this whole story is that the person whose name we don't know, the anonymous spy who as an act of service to his monarch was forced to poop out a message from the king, has achieved a sort of immortality. Lord John Bellasyse, the governor of Newark, was an old survivor. He survived the war, he lived through the period of parliamentarian rule that we call the interregnum, and was still alive during the restoration of Charles II. One of Lord John Bellasyse's friends was a lowly naval administrator called Samuel Pepys. Lord Bellasyse told Samuel Pepys a couple of stories about his time as governor in Newark, including a certain story about a spy who turned up in his residence and demanded some physic and defecated a message from the king. So there it is. Newark's most disgusting Civil War story, accidentally preserved for posterity in Samuel Pepys' diary. Look it up if you don't believe me. Thank you for listening. This episode of 17th Century Tales from Cavalier Newark was recorded and written by Adam Nightingale from a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. The music was provided by Mark Nightingale. Next week's episode looks at the extraordinary life and fascinating writings of Margaret Cavendish, scientist, fashionista, and arguably one of the first science fiction authors in the English language. For previous episodes and other incredible resources to occupy your brains and minds and souls in these interesting times, check out the Learning from Home page on the National Civil War website, or follow the link underneath. As always, stay safe.